The valet at the Wren House restaurant handed me back my own car keys with a look of pity so heavy it felt like a slap, and that was the moment I understood, standing there in my anniversary dress with a bouquet of white peonies wilting in my arms, that my husband of 7 years was inside that restaurant at that very moment, holding hands across a candlelit table with the woman he called his first love, on the one day of the year that was supposed to belong only to me. Before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you how a stack of $100 bills and 6 shirtless dancers became the strangest, most freeing revenge a heartbroken woman ever plotted in a parking lot, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness even when it is hard to give, if you believe people can be forgiven without being let off the hook, if you still believe in second chances earned rather than second chances handed out for free, then please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from, share this with someone who has ever loved a person more than that person deserved, and subscribe to our channel, because our community grows every single day through people just like you who still believe love is worth fighting for, even when it breaks your heart first. My name is Margaret Ashby Whitlock, though everyone who loves me calls me Meg, and on the afternoon my marriage cracked open in a restaurant parking lot, I was 34 years old and I thought I knew exactly who my husband was. Grant Whitlock and I had built something together over 11 years, 7 of them as husband and wife, and if you had asked me that morning to describe our marriage I would have used words like steady and safe and good, the kind of words that sound boring until you lose them. Grant ran a mid-sized architecture firm in Charleston that his father had started decades earlier, and I had spent the last 4 years building my own small floral design studio 2 blocks from the historic district, the kind of business that survives on wedding contracts and referrals and a lot of early mornings hauling buckets of hydrangeas. We were not a flashy couple. We did not post elaborate anniversary tributes online. But we had a rhythm, a private language built from a decade of inside jokes and shared grief over his mother's passing and shared joy over the 2 miscarriages we had somehow survived without it destroying us, and I trusted that rhythm the way you trust the sun to rise. That morning, our 7th anniversary, Grant had kissed my forehead before I was even fully awake and told me he had a surprise planned, that I should dress up, that he would text me the details of where to meet him because he had a morning meeting he could not move. I remember lying in bed after he left, smiling at the ceiling, feeling grateful in that quiet unremarkable way you feel grateful for ordinary happiness, not knowing that ordinary happiness was about to be set on fire. I spent the day at my studio arranging peonies for a Saturday wedding, humming along to the radio, occasionally catching my reflection in the cooler glass and thinking that 34 looked good on me, that 7 years of marriage looked good on me. At 4 in the afternoon, his text arrived, Wren House, 6:30, wear the blue dress. I remember feeling a small flutter of nostalgia because the blue dress was the one I had worn on our second date, the one he always said made my eyes look like the harbor at dusk. I got there 20 minutes early because I could not stand the anticipation, and I asked the valet to hold my car while I checked in with the host, and it was the host, a young woman with kind eyes and an uncomfortable expression, who told me that a table for 2 under the name Whitlock had already been seated, that they had arrived nearly an hour ago. I remember my stomach doing something strange, a slow cold drop, because Grant should not have already been seated, Grant should have been waiting for me at the door with that crooked smile of his. I asked her to point me toward the table, and she hesitated in a way that should have warned me, and then she pointed, and I walked through that dining room in my blue harbor dusk dress toward a table by the window where my husband sat holding both hands of a woman I did not recognize, laughing at something she had said, looking at her with an expression I had not seen directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. I did not scream. I did not throw anything, though God knows I wanted to. I stood there for what felt like an hour but was probably 11 seconds, watching my husband's face light up for a stranger on the day that belonged to me, and something in my chest went very quiet and very cold, the kind of quiet that comes right before a storm decides which direction to travel. Grant looked up and saw me, and his face did something complicated, guilt and panic and something almost like relief, as if part of him had wanted to be caught. The woman across from him turned, and I recognized something in her bone structure, in the particular tilt of her chin, that made my mind flash back to a conversation Grant and I had had years earlier, half drunk on our porch, when he told me about a girl named Claire Donnelly he had loved in college, his first real love, the one who left him for someone else and broke something in him that took years to heal. He had told me that story like it was ancient history, like it was a scar he was showing me to prove he trusted me. I had held his hand and told him I was glad he had healed. I never imagined that scar had a name I would one day watch him hold hands with on our anniversary. I did not make a scene, not because I am a saint, but because some deep instinct in me understood that whatever I did next in that dining room would become the story people told about me, and I refused to let humiliation be the only tool I had left. I walked to the table, and I set the peonies down gently in the center of it, right between their clasped hands, and I said only one sentence, quiet enough that only they could hear it: "Happy anniversary, Grant, I hope she's worth it." Then I turned and walked out of that restaurant with my spine straight and my hands shaking, and I did not cry until I reached my car, and even then I gave myself exactly 90 seconds before I made myself stop, because 90 seconds of grief was all I could afford before the anger arrived. And the anger, when it arrived, was enormous and clarifying and, strangely, almost calm. Sitting in my car in that parking lot, mascara streaked down to my jaw, I reached into my purse out of habit and my fingers found Grant's black card, the one he had given me years earlier for emergencies, the one I almost never used because I had my own accounts and my own pride. I stared at that little rectangle of metal in the fading afternoon light, and something shifted in me, some tectonic plate of grief sliding into something closer to resolve. I want to be honest with you, the way I would be honest with a sister sitting across a kitchen table, that what I did next was not born from wisdom. It was born from heartbreak wearing the mask of humor, from a woman who needed to feel powerful for exactly one afternoon before she figured out how to actually rebuild her life. I called my best friend, Odette Marchetti, who had been my maid of honor and who answered on the second ring already sensing something was wrong because best friends always do. I told her what had happened in 3 shaking sentences, and there was a silence on the line, and then Odette, God bless her fierce loyal heart, said, "Meg, what do you want to do about it? Not, are you okay, not, I'm so sorry, but, what do you want to do about it?" Because she understood that I needed action more than I needed sympathy in that moment. What I wanted, I told her, laughing in that unhinged way you laugh when you are 1 inch from sobbing, was to throw the most ridiculous, joyful, over-the-top party of my entire life, on his dime, in broad daylight, where every person who mattered to me could watch me refuse to be pitiful. I did not want revenge that hurt him financially in some crippling way, because despite everything, I did not want to destroy the man, I wanted to reclaim the day. So I told Odette my plan, half-formed and completely absurd, and she screamed with laughter so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear, and within 20 minutes we had a plan. I would rent out the community pavilion at Chessmen Park, the open-air one with the white columns where we had actually had our wedding reception 7 years earlier, and I would fill it, that very evening while there was still daylight left, because I refused to let this become a nighttime memory, with music and dancing and every friend I could reach on short notice, and yes, 6 male dancers from an entertainment agency Odette swore by from a bachelorette party she had attended the year before, because if Grant wanted to make our anniversary a spectacle, I was going to make it a spectacle that told the truth about who deserved celebrating. I want to pause here and say something important, because I know some of you watching are wondering whether I am proud of what I did next, and the honest answer is complicated, the way most honest answers are. I am not proud of using his card out of spite. I am not proud of the version of myself that wanted, for one burning afternoon, to make him feel small the way he had made me feel small. But I am proud that even in my darkest hour, my instinct was toward life and laughter and community rather than toward destruction, and I think that tells you something true about who I am underneath the hurt. By 6 o'clock, less than 90 minutes after I had walked out of that restaurant, the pavilion at Chessmen Park was transforming. Odette had called in favors I did not know she had, a string of paper lanterns even though we swore we'd be done before dark, folding tables borrowed from her church, and a local Bluetooth speaker system dragged out of her garage. My studio assistant, a sweet-faced 26-year-old named Priya Okonkwo Hale who had become like a little sister to me over the years, showed up with 3 buckets of leftover wedding flowers because she refused to let me celebrate anything, even chaos, without proper florals. Word spread the way it does among people who love you, a text here, a phone call there, and by 6:30 there were nearly 40 people gathering under those white columns, women from my book club, my cousin Beatrix who drove in from 2 towns over the moment she heard my voice crack on the phone, my elderly neighbor Mr. Castellano who showed up in his Sunday cardigan because he said, and I quote, "Any woman brave enough to throw a party after being humiliated deserves an audience, and even a few of Grant's own friends, the ones who I suspect had complicated feelings about their friend's behavior, arrived quietly and stood near the back like witnesses to something they weren't quite sure how to feel about." The dancers arrived at 7, still full daylight in the late summer evening, 6 men in matching black trousers and crisp white shirts who turned out to be, refreshingly, nothing like the caricature I had braced myself for. Their choreographer, a broad-shouldered gentle giant named Desmond Faraday who ran the agency Odette had used, took one look at my tear-swollen eyes when I explained the situation, and instead of treating me like a punchline, he sat me down on a folding chair and told me something I have never forgotten. He said, "Ma'am, we do a lot of bachelorette parties, and most of the time it's just fun and silliness, and that's fine, that's what people want. But every once in a while we get called out to something like this, a woman standing at the edge of something breaking, and when that happens, my job isn't really about the dancing at all. It's about making sure that for 1 hour, you remember you're the kind of woman people show up for." I cried again, but it was a different kind of crying, the kind that clears something out rather than the kind that drowns you. What followed was not, contrary to what you might expect from the title of this story, some vulgar spectacle. Desmond and his dancers understood the assignment in a way I had not fully articulated even to myself. They performed with humor and warmth, pulling my cousin Beatrix and even Mr. Castellano into a ridiculous conga line, turning what could have been a bitter, mean-spirited stunt into something closer to a community celebration of a woman who refused to let one man's cruelty define her worth. Odette had set up her phone on a tripod, not to record some viral humiliation of Grant, but because she wanted, in her words, "proof that you laughed today, Meg, so you can watch it later on the days you forget you're allowed to." Music played, string lights that Priya had strung earlier flickered on even though the sun had not fully set, and for 2 hours, in that open-air pavilion where I had once promised to love a man in sickness and health, I let myself be surrounded by people who loved me without conditions, without an audition, without a first love waiting in the wings to remind me I was second choice. It was during the 3rd song, while I was laughing so hard at Mr. Castellano's attempt to learn a hip roll that I nearly fell off my chair, that I saw Grant's car pull into the parking lot at the edge of the park. I felt the whole world tilt for a second time that day. He must have gotten a call, probably from one of his friends standing near the back of the crowd, or perhaps a notification from the card company about an unusually large charge from an entertainment agency, and he had come, I would later learn, in a state of genuine panic, imagining God knows what kind of scene. What he found instead, when he walked slowly toward the pavilion with his tie loosened and his face pale, was his wife, radiant and laughing, surrounded by 40 people who loved her, dancing badly and joyfully in the golden hour light, looking more alive than she had looked to him in longer than either of us wanted to admit. I want to tell you honestly what I felt when I saw him standing there at the edge of the pavilion, because it was not triumph, though I had expected triumph, and it was not rage, though I had earned the right to rage. What I felt, watching him stand there in his rumpled shirt looking like a stranger at his own wife's party, was a strange and unexpected wave of grief for the marriage we had actually had, the good years, the real years, before whatever had been eating at him had grown large enough to walk him back into another woman's hands. Desmond, sensing the shift in the air, quietly signaled his dancers to wrap the performance, and the music faded into something softer, and the crowd's attention turned, slowly, uncomfortably, toward the man standing at the edge of the celebration he had inadvertently funded. Grant did not try to make a scene either, which surprised me. He stood there for a long moment, and then he asked, in a voice smaller than I had ever heard him use, if we could talk. I looked at Odette, and she gave me the smallest nod, the kind that says I'm right here if you need me, and I walked with Grant away from the pavilion, toward a bench near the old fountain where, 7 years earlier, we had taken our first photograph as husband and wife. He told me everything, sitting on that bench in the fading gold light while our friends' laughter drifted over from the pavilion. He told me that Claire Donnelly had reached out to him 3 months earlier, out of nowhere, after her own divorce, wanting closure on something that had ended badly between them in college. He told me he had meant it to be one lunch, one conversation to close an old wound, and instead it had become a habit, a secret he told himself was harmless because nothing physical had happened, a slow erosion of honesty that he had not had the courage to name even to himself. He told me that somewhere in the last year he had become quietly, deeply unhappy, not because of anything I had done, but because his father's illness the previous winter had cracked something open in him about mortality and unfinished business, and instead of bringing that fear to me, his actual wife, the woman who had held his hand through both miscarriages and his mother's funeral, he had gone looking for comfort in the wreckage of an old love because it was easier than facing the terrifying vulnerability of admitting he was scared to the person who actually mattered. I listened to all of it without interrupting, which took more discipline than anything else I did that entire day, because my instinct was to defend myself, to remind him of every sacrifice, every hard year we had survived together. But I have learned, in the years since, that listening fully to someone's confession, even when it enrages you, is sometimes the only way to find out whether there is anything left worth saving. When he finished, he said the words I imagine every betrayed spouse both longs for and dreads. He asked if there was any way I could ever forgive him. I did not answer him that evening, not because I wanted to punish him with silence, but because I genuinely did not know the answer, and I have never believed in giving people false comfort just to end an uncomfortable conversation. I told him that I needed time, real time, not a symbolic few days but actual months, and that forgiveness, if it came at all, would not look like pretending nothing had happened. I told him about Desmond's words in the pavilion, about being reminded that I was the kind of woman people show up for, and I told him that whatever decision I made about our marriage, it would be made from that place of remembered worth, not from fear of being alone or from the comfortable habit of 7 years together. He nodded, and for the first time since I had walked into that restaurant, I saw actual tears in his eyes, not performance, not manipulation, but the particular grief of a man realizing he had nearly thrown away something real for the ghost of something long dead. I share all of this with you not because I want your judgment of Grant, and not because I want your pity for me, but because I think there is something important in this story about what happens after the dramatic moment, after the viral-worthy scene of dancers in a park, after the confrontation everyone imagines when they hear a title like this one. The real story, the one that matters, happened in the months that followed, slow and unglamorous and far harder than any single afternoon of righteous fury. I moved into Odette's guest room for 6 weeks, which taught me more about myself than almost any other period of my adult life. I learned that I could survive alone, that my floral studio did not need a husband's approval to thrive, that I had opinions and preferences and a personality that had, without my fully noticing, become quieter and smaller over the years of marriage, folded neatly into the shape of Grant's needs. Odette, bless her, never once told me what to do. She simply made space for me to remember who I had been before I became half of a couple, and in that remembering, I found something I had not realized I had lost. Grant, for his part, did something that ultimately mattered more to me than any grand romantic gesture could have. He did not send flowers, which would have felt tone-deaf coming from a florist's husband anyway. He did not show up outside my work with a boombox in some misguided imitation of the movies. Instead, he started going to therapy, actual weekly therapy with a counselor named Dr. Priscilla Ansel, and he asked, humbly, if I would eventually be willing to join him for couples counseling, not to fix things quickly, but to understand honestly whether there was a version of our marriage worth rebuilding. He also, without being asked, told his father's old business partner that he needed to take a step back from the firm for a while, and he spent those weeks doing something he had never done in the 11 years I had known him. He sat with his grief about his father's illness instead of running from it, in therapy, in long solitary walks, in a journal his therapist encouraged him to keep, which he later, with my permission, shared parts of with me, and reading his handwriting described fear he had never once spoken aloud to me in 7 years of marriage broke my heart open in a way that was somehow different from the way the restaurant had broken it. I want to be careful here, because I know some of you watching have been in relationships where an apology was used as a leash, where promises of change were just another chapter in a long book of excuses, and I do not want to romanticize reconciliation as though it is always the right or safe choice. There were moments during those months when I nearly decided to file for divorce, when the image of Grant holding Claire Donnelly's hands would surface in my mind at 3 in the morning and I would lie in Odette's guest room certain that I could never trust him again. I want you to know that decision would have been valid too. Leaving would not have made me weak or vengeful, it would have made me a woman who knew her own worth. But over those weeks, watching Grant's actions rather than just his apologies, watching him do the unglamorous daily work of becoming honest rather than the flashy work of grand gestures, I slowly began to believe that the man sitting across from me in Dr. Ansell's office was doing genuine repair, not performance. We started couples counseling in October, 3 months after the anniversary that broke us open, and it was in that small beige office with its box of tissues perpetually within reach that I finally learned the fuller truth about Claire Donnelly, and, strangely, it made me feel something closer to compassion than jealousy. Claire, it turned out, was not some scheming villain plotting to steal my husband. She was a woman going through her own devastating divorce, reaching out to an old boyfriend for the specific, selfish, understandable comfort of being reminded she had once been loved well by someone, and Grant, in his own fear and grief, had let himself become her comfort instead of setting a boundary, instead of telling me the truth that would have let us face his fear about his father together, as partners, the way we had faced every other hard thing. Understanding that did not excuse what he did. But it helped me see it not as evidence that I had been unlovable or insufficient, but as evidence that Grant had made a cowardly choice in a moment of fear, the kind of choice that ordinary flawed people make when they have not yet learned how to sit with their own pain honestly. By December, I had made my decision, and I want to tell you honestly that it was not an easy or purely happy decision, but a considered one. I moved back into our house, not because Grant had earned some magical forgiveness through a certain number of therapy sessions, but because I had done my own work in those months of separation and had arrived at a genuine, sober belief that the marriage we could rebuild might actually be more honest, more resilient, than the one we had lost. I told Grant, on the day I moved back, that forgiveness was not a single moment but an ongoing choice I would be making, some days easily and some days with great difficulty, and that he needed to understand there would be scar tissue in our marriage from this, permanently, the way any body carries the memory of a serious wound even after it heals. He said he understood, and more importantly, in the 2 years since, he has lived like he understood, choosing transparency in small daily ways that matter more than any single romantic gesture ever could. We had our 8th anniversary that following summer, and this time, Grant asked me, weeks in advance, what I actually wanted to do, no surprises, no secret plans, because we had both learned that trust rebuilds itself in the boring, visible, unglamorous moments far more than in grand romantic surprises. I told him I wanted to go back to Chessmen Park, to that same pavilion, in the daylight, and have a small gathering with the same friends who had shown up for me that terrible, beautiful evening. Odette came, of course, still fiercely loyal, still ready to defend me at a moment's notice, though thankfully with nothing to defend me from that day. Priya brought flowers again, this time joyful ones instead of leftover wedding stock, arrangements of sunflowers and blue delphinium that she said reminded her of resilience. Mr. Castellano, now 81 and slower on his feet, still showed up in his good cardigan and asked, with a wicked twinkle in his eye, whether Desmond and his dancers might make a return appearance, which made the whole party dissolve into the kind of laughter that heals something in a room. Desmond did come, actually, though not to dance this time. Odette had kept in touch with him over the months, and he had become, unexpectedly, a friend to both of us, a man who had wandered into the worst afternoon of my life doing a job he thought was about entertainment and discovered, as he later told me, that sometimes the most important thing you can offer a hurting person is simply the reminder that they deserve to be celebrated. He gave a small toast that day, standing under those same white columns, and he said something I think about often, that love is not proven in the grand gesture of the anniversary date, the reservation, the flowers, but in what a person does after they have been seen clearly, flaws and failures included, and chooses to stay and do the harder work of becoming trustworthy again. I think about that black card sometimes, still sitting in my wallet, and I laugh now in a way that no longer has any bitterness in it, because it became, against every odd, not a symbol of my humiliation but a strange and unlikely instrument of my healing. It reminded me, on the worst day of my marriage, that I was not powerless, that grief did not have to calcify into despair, that a woman betrayed on her anniversary could choose, even in the wreckage, to surround herself with music and laughter and community instead of curling into isolation and shame. I do not recommend my exact methods to everyone. I am fully aware that hiring dancers with your husband's card is not standard marriage counseling advice, and Dr. Ansel, with a barely suppressed smile, told me as much in our very first session together. But I do believe, with my whole heart, in the deeper instinct beneath that chaotic afternoon, the instinct to reach for joy and community rather than despair when someone you love breaks your heart. Grant and I are not the same couple we were before that anniversary, and I have come to believe that is a good thing, not a tragedy. We are more honest now, in ways that are sometimes uncomfortable but always, I think, worth the discomfort. He calls his therapist every single week, even now, 2 years later, because he has learned that emotional maintenance is not a sign of weakness but a discipline, the same way I learned that my floral studio needed regular pruning and care to keep flourishing. We talk now, actually talk, about fear and grief and the parts of ourselves we used to hide from each other in the name of keeping the peace. And Claire Donnelly, for what it is worth, eventually reached out to me directly, nearly a year later, with an apology that surprised me with its sincerity, telling me she had been so lost in her own pain that she had not fully reckoned with what her choices meant for another woman's marriage, and I found, to my own surprise, that I was able to accept that apology without reopening the wound, because healing, I have learned, does not require you to keep the door locked forever against everyone who once hurt you. It only requires you to choose, deliberately and with open eyes, who gets to walk back through it. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this: heartbreak does not have to make you small. On the worst day of my marriage, I could have gone home and cried alone in a dark house, and no one would have blamed me for that, and some days, in the weeks that followed, I did exactly that, and that is all right too. But on that particular afternoon, something in me reached instead for light, for daylight, for the people who loved me, for laughter loud enough to drown out humiliation, and I believe that instinct, more than any clever revenge plot, is what ultimately saved not just my marriage but my sense of myself. Whatever you are facing right now, whatever betrayal or disappointment has cracked open your own ordinary Tuesday or your own long-anticipated anniversary, I hope you remember that you are allowed to grieve and still be magnificent, that forgiveness, when it is real, is not weakness but one of the hardest and most powerful choices a human being can make, and that sometimes the people who show up for you in a public park with borrowed folding chairs and second-hand string lights are the truest proof you have that you were never as alone or as unworthy as heartbreak wants you to believe. Before we close this story today, I want to ask you something, because this community means more to me than you probably realize. If you have ever forgiven someone who truly hurt you, or if you are still working up the courage to decide whether forgiveness is even the right path for your own situation, I would love for you to leave a comment below sharing what forgiveness has taught you, or what question about it you are still sitting with, because some of the wisest words I have ever received about healing have come from strangers in comment sections who turned out to understand my heart better than people who had known me for years. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone in your life who needs a reminder that second chances can be real when they are earned rather than assumed, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Our family here is built on exactly this kind of honesty, the messy, hopeful, unglamorous truth about how people actually heal, and I am so grateful every single time one of you chooses to be part of it. Thank you for sitting with Meg's story today, for believing, even for a few minutes, in kindness and forgiveness and the stubborn, daylight kind of hope that insists on dancing in a public park instead of disappearing quietly into the dark. Until our next story, take care of your own heart and remember that you, too, are the kind of person people show up for.